Some stories need to be told over and over again. There is an old wisdom story that I've told you before, but I believe it's more important than ever right now. We are in troubled times. It feels like our country is split in two. In fact, it feels like lots of the nations around the world are split in two. There's too much anger, too much fighting, too many hateful words. The political climate in the United States is the most poisonous I've seen in my lifetime. And it's bleeding out into the wider culture, whether that's social media or other forums. It's got to stop. Not the political disagreement. That's just part of life. I get that. But the bitter, harsh, nasty speech has got to stop. It's more important than ever for people of faith to put their faith into practice and spread ripples of kindness and goodness and compassion. So, I've told you this story before, but it's more important than ever. There was an elder, and the elder told a young person, "There are 2 dogs inside me. One dog is mean, and the other dog is good. The mean dog fights the good dog all the time." So the young person asked, "Which dog wins?" And the elder said, "Whichever one I feed the most." Which dog are you going to feed? That question is more important than ever. Today is the last Sunday after Pentecost. It's also called the Feast of Christ the King. We hear again the story of Jesus before Pilate. Both Jesus and Pontius Pilate are named in the creed that we say together Sunday by Sunday. They come together in today's reading from the Gospel of John. And each of them represents a contrasting way, like the 2 dogs in the story. Pilate's way is the way of force and violence. Jesus represents the way of suffering and love. Which is going to win? Which are you going to feed? Now, in the usual way of looking at things, it's no contest. Pilate's way wins every time. Force and violence win in the short term. You know, we do have a couple of stories about Pilate from outside the Gospels, outside the New Testament. There was a Jewish historian named Josephus who lived a few years after the time of Christ, and he ended up becoming a Roman citizen. And then he took up writing history, and he recorded some of the history of Palestine in the 1st century. He also left us a couple of stories in that history about Pontius Pilate. One year, Pilate brought his soldiers from Caesarea on the Mediterranean coast into the city of Jerusalem for winter quarters. Now, that army, the Roman army, did not carry flags and colors. The Roman army carried standards with medallions of the emperor. Now, Pilate was aware that the Jews regarded these medallions as idols. They were forbidden under Jewish law. Previous governors had not brought them into Jerusalem, the city of the temple, because they were willing to respect Jewish sensitivities. Not Pilate. He had his soldiers bring them in during the night. And so the next day, these medallions were seen in the city. The people of Jerusalem were angry, and they protested. For 5 days and 5 nights, they did something like what we would call a sit-down strike. So then, Pilate sent his troops out to surround them, to surround these protesters, and threaten them with death if they did not disperse. Immediately, the crowd offered their bared necks to the swords of the soldiers. They were willing to die rather than betray their God. Pilate had to give in and relent rather than begin what would have been a bloody massacre. Now, that's the first story Josephus tells. The second one comes a few years later, and it shows that Pilate had learned a lesson. Pilate grabbed some money from the temple treasury, and he used it to fund an aqueduct for the city. He knew there would be more protests, but he was ready. This time he had his soldiers mingle in the crowds in civilian clothing without their swords, but they all had clubs and cudgels. On Pilate's signal, his soldiers in disguise started to beat the crowds savagely, but not kill them. It started a panic, and the people dispersed. He made the people submit, but he managed to avoid a massacre that time. Still, Pilate's way was the way of force and violence. And we've seen that way in every period of human history as much now as at any time. Pilate's way is not the way of Jesus. So which do we choose? The Procurator or the Peasant? In the usual way of looking at things, it's no contest. Pilate's way wins every time. Force and violence will win in the short term. But for the long term, my money is on the way of Jesus. The first Easter day was our first hint of what wins in the long term. It turns out that in God's ultimate plan, suffering and love will defeat force and violence. Which one will win, Pilate or Jesus? Which dog inside you will you feed, the mean one or the good one? Which way will it be? Well, Pilate's way is easier. It's easier to force enemies than to make friends with them. It's easier to yell at the people we disagree with rather than to listen to them. It's easier to deploy an army than to die on a cross. So who's going to win, Pilate or Jesus? Which way will it be? Which dog inside you will you feed? I can't answer for you, but I know how I will answer. Kindness and compassion and love are as important now as ever in human history. As has been said many times by many great speakers, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Let's bet on the long-term victory of the way of Jesus. Jesus did go to the cross, but then came Easter. And that is our hint, and that is our hope. Let's bet on the long-term victory of the Jesus way. In God's ultimate plan, suffering and love will defeat force and violence. So, I know which dog I must feed.